Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Today, the subcommittee is meeting to hear testimony on 4 bills that make what I consider long overdue reforms to the federal laws that govern oil, gas, and coal development on public lands. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements are limited to the chair and to the ranking minority member or their designee. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent for Congressman McAdams to sit on the dais and participate in this morning's hearings. Hearing no objection, so ordered. First, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and particularly thank those of you who traveled great distances to be here today. In this Congress, this subcommittee has held hearings on how fossil fuel development impacts air quality, tribal communities, water resources, and the climate, and how the Trump administration steamrolls public input throughout the leasing process. But a critical topic that we have not addressed until today are the sweetheart deals that oil, gas, and coal companies receive when operating on public lands. The bills on this morning's agenda will close long-standing industry loopholes that have allowed fossil fuel executives to reap enormous profits while failing to pay their fair share and failing to cover cleanup costs. H.R. 2711, Congresswoman DeGette's Methane Waste Prevention Act, requires the Interior Department to reduce the waste of natural gas from venting, flaring, and leaks from their operations of natural gas on public lands. Methane emissions from oil and gas sites are a wasted resource, and the pollution harms local health and contributes to climate change. At last Thursday's hearing, Congressman Westerman submitted into the record the GAO 2019 high-risk report to support a bill that was under consideration. However, that same GAO report identified Interior's 2018 rollback of the BLM methane rule as an action that hurts the government's ability to collect the royalties it is due. So I want to thank my colleague for highlighting the GAO's impartial work that calls for BLM to reduce methane waste from public lands. H.R. 4346, my Bonding Reform and Taxpayers Protection Act, increases minimum oil and gas bonding amounts and requires that they be adjusted regularly for inflation. Bonds held by BLM are essential to clean up orphan wells and for ensuring that taxpayers don't pay for industry's mess. Last week, GAO released a report finding that the bonds held by BLM are insufficient to reclaim wells on public lands and that the public could be on the hook for millions of dollars of reclamation costs. Minimum bond amounts have not increased since 1960, and the GAO says that these bonds must be increased if they are to reflect the actual costs of restoring the land to its original condition, which we are regularly told by industry that it is committed to doing. H.R. 4364, the Taxpayer Fairness for Resource Development Act, is a bipartisan bill introduced by Congressman McAdams and Congressman Rooney that updates the archaic royalty rate, minimum bid, and rental rates that companies pay when they are extracting resources from public lands. The royalty rate for onshore oil and gas has not increased in nearly a century. Let me repeat that. The royalty rate for oil and gas has not increased in nearly a century. Even as the western states have increased their rates and companies have made greater and greater profits. Increasing the royalty rate to match what companies pay to drill offshore in federal lands will guarantee millions of more dollars that states can spend on infrastructure and education, and will return millions of more dollars to U.S. taxpayers. Furthermore, the minimum bid amount has not kept pace with inflation over the last 30 years, and oil and gas companies can currently lock up public lands all for the price of a cup of coffee. That's actually an out-of-date metaphor. Coffee is often way more expensive than locking up on public lands. Once again, the GAO has a substantial body of work on these issues and has consistently found that failure to increase these rates has deprived taxpayers of billions of dollars. H.R. 4435, Congressman Cartwright's Coal Cleanup Taxpayer Protection Act, prevents coal companies from self-bonding, a risky tactic that leaves taxpayers exposed to cleanup expenses when those companies go bankrupt. With cheap natural gas driving coal companies out of business, the GAO has recommended ending self-bonding so local communities and taxpayers are protected from the consequences of bankruptcies. As we speak, public lands are being exploited by energy companies while taxpayers are being shortchanged. Considering the Trump administration's desire to drill on as much land as possible, these four bills have never been more necessary than they are today. With that, I want to thank each of the bill's sponsors, and I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and I now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee will consider four bills which will impose onerous and unwanted costs on the energy industry under the guise of generating more revenue for the taxpayers. In reality, these bills will increase the cost of operating on federal lands, driving away investment, reducing energy production necessary to power our homes and businesses, and reducing revenue to the states and taxpayers, not to mention eliminating good-paying jobs. For the record, I'd like to introduce an article from New Mexico with the governor signing spending and pay increases for teachers primarily driven by revenues from oil and gas that, ironically, they're trying to put out of business. H.R. 4364 increases royalty rates and fees for federal oil and gas leases and allows the Secretary of Interior to set royalty rates at a level comparable with state royalty rates. The federal royalty rate is lower than state royalty rates, but even so, federal lands are not nearly as competitive as state and private lands. In fiscal year 2018, federal lands contributed only 8% of all oil, 9% of natural gas, and 6% of natural gas liquids. This effort to raise royalties and fees on every aspect of oil and gas production is not an effort to return more revenues to the taxpayer. It's an effort to stifle responsible domestic production right out of the keep it in the ground playbook. H.R. 4364 will cause direct harm to Western states, threatening their budgets and services that impact the daily lives of each citizen. For instance, the state of New Mexico is on track for a record budget year, mostly due to oil and gas production in the Permian Basin. H.R. 4364 is a threat to this revenue stream, which New Mexico is using to give teachers raises and to improve the public school system. H.R. 2711 imposes unnecessary Obama regulations on venting and flaring of methane, resulting in greater costs to operators and reduced revenues to taxpayers. Methane emissions have decreased significantly in recent decades, largely due to technological advances. Today, less than 1% of natural gas is flared, and methane emissions are 15% lower than they were in 1990, even though production increased over 50% during that time period. If my colleagues are truly concerned about methane emissions, they should support investing in domestic pipeline infrastructures so we can move these products safely and efficiently. We know that pipelines are the safest way to transport oil and gas, and will reduce the need for venting and flaring. Prohibiting flaring, as H.R. 2711 ultimately requires, makes no exemptions for circumstances when appropriate infrastructure is not available, or even in case of emergencies. H.R. 4346 aims to make providing bond coverage for reclamation activities more costly for operators. All operators must provide bond coverage to ensure they sufficiently reclaim wells and mines. H.R. 4336 arbitrarily raises the amount operators must provide to cover their operations, which could prevent smaller operations from accessing federal lands. An overwhelming majority of oil and gas operators responsibly complete their reclamation responsibilities. According to GAO, of the 96,199 wells on federal lands, 296 are orphaned, roughly at 0.3%. This bill would punish all operators from the actions of a few and result in reduced production on federal lands. We should ensure that all operators meet their obligations under the law, but this bill takes the wrong approach. Finally, H.R. 4435 would eliminate self-bonding for coal operations under federal law. States are permitted to accept self-bonds for reclamation responsibilities. Coal mining is a heavily regulated industry, and bond requirements are no exceptions. To be qualified for a self-bond, operators must have a net worth of over $10 million, fixed assets of at least $20 million, and an A or higher bond rating. H.R. 4435 would prevent the use of self-bonding altogether, overruling current state discretion regarding how to best reclaim coal mines, even though the states are well equipped to evaluate if self-bonding is appropriate for their local operators. I would also like to note that according to the National Mining Association, not one company that has utilized a self-bonding option has ever walked away from their reclamation responsibilities. In fact, they regularly win awards for having the most successful reclamation projects. Month after month, Democrats on this committee have proposed bills and wasted our time with one objective in mind: to keep our valuable resources in the ground. My colleagues would rather meet our energy needs with oil and gas sourced from Saudi Arabia and Russia than to promote responsible development at home. If we were serious about reducing methane emissions and increasing returns to the taxpayer, we would be talking about the tangible solutions in a bill my colleagues and I introduced earlier this month, the American Energy First Act. And I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Gosar. Ranking Member Gosar, too. I'm now going to introduce today's first witness, Ms. DeGette. She's the representative for Colorado's 1st Congressional District and the original sponsor of H.R. 2711, the Methane Waste Prevention Act. Ms. DeGette, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this important hearing on these 3 bills. My bill, H.R. 2711, will reinstate and update the Obama-era methane waste and pollution prevention standards of the Bureau of Land Management and the Environmental Protection Agency. Methane is the primary ingredient of natural gas. It's a powerful greenhouse gas that's up to 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And when it's released into the atmosphere, methane does great harm to our environment. It's one of the leading contributors to global climate change, and it greatly exacerbates the ongoing climate crisis. But when it's captured, methane can be used as a valuable resource, a resource that belongs to the American public when it's extracted from public lands. So if we're going to be serious about solving the climate crisis and be responsible stewards of our public's resources, we've got to be serious about stopping the release of methane into our atmosphere. My legislation would require oil and gas producers on federal land to capture more of the methane that they produce. It would require drillers to capture 85% of all gas produced within 3 years of the bill's enactment and 99% of all the gas produced within 5 years. It would also ban the practice of venting on our public lands, and it would prohibit methane flaring at any new wells constructed after the bill is passed. Mr. Chairman, I think this is a common sense bill that is greatly needed right now. The Trump administration has taken drastic steps over the last few years that, if allowed to go unchecked, will threaten our public health, exacerbate our climate crisis, and waste some of our nation's most valuable resources. Just last month, for example, the EPA proposed rolling back inspections for methane leaks and easing the repair requirements for oil and gas operations. Just as worrisome, last year, BLM gutted measures we had put in place to reduce methane venting and flaring on our public lands. This bill has widespread support from a variety of stakeholders, including, frankly, many in industry who recognize the benefits of reducing our methane emissions from oil and gas emissions on public lands. The industry has spent enormous amounts of money, in fact, to try to convince people of the environmental benefits of using natural gas. And while it's true that the expanded use of natural gas has helped reduce our need for coal, and while it's also true that a natural gas power plant releases less carbon than a coal-burning plant, none of that matters if our drillers are just allowing millions of pounds of this highly potent global warming pollutant to leak into our atmosphere. Allowing just 1 pound of methane to leak at a drilling site wipes out the benefits of reducing 80 pounds of carbon dioxide at the power plant. Let me just say that again. Allowing 1 pound of methane to leak at a drilling site wipes out the benefit of reducing 80 pounds of carbon dioxide. We need oil and gas producers to take a hard look at what they're doing to contain this gas at every step of the process, from its extraction to the processing to the transportation and to the storage. And unfortunately, the only way that's going to happen is if we require the producers to do this under the law. Given how fast our climate is changing, with devastating impacts occurring much faster than predicted just a few years ago, the need for this legislation couldn't be greater. But you know, it's not just the environment we're trying to protect with this bill. America's natural gas supply belongs to the American people. Oil and gas companies are required to pay the American people royalties for oil and gas they take from our public lands. They're not, however, required to reimburse us for the gas that they just waste to the atmosphere. By requiring that companies capture 99% of all the methane that they produce, we're not only protecting our environment, we're also ensuring that the American public is fully compensated for the resources being taken from their lands. The GAO issued a report recently, I think the chairman referred to it, that said that the Department of Interior's oil and gas programs are among the most mismanaged in our government. And in that report, the GAO clearly said that, quote, better methane control is important for ensuring that the federal government receives all of the royalties that it's due. Mr. Chairman, the Methane Waste Prevention Act is a win for the environment, and it's a win for our economy. It will help solve the climate crisis sooner, it helps protect the public's health, and it helps us put more of the planet's finite resources to use. Mr. Chairman, I have 3 documents that I'd like to move to submit to the record. The first one is a letter from the Clean Air Task Force dated September 23rd. The second is 2 Colorado Oil and Gas Association fact sheets about air quality. And the final one is a joint statement on the EPA's proposed policy amendments to the new source performance standards for the oil and gas industry. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And they will be accepted without objection into the record. And thank you, Ms. DeGette. Next, Mr. McAdams, the representative for Utah's 4th Congressional District and the original sponsor of H.R. 4364, the Taxpayer Fairness for Resource Development Act. Mr. McAdams, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you to Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee for letting me join this hearing and providing the opportunity for me to speak on my bipartisan bill, the Taxpayer Fairness for Resource Development Act. I also want to acknowledge our witnesses and thank them for taking the time to advocate for fiscal responsibility as well. And that's why I'm here today, to advocate for fiscal responsibility and to ensure that our taxpayers are getting a fair return for their resources developed on public lands. In Utah, the federal government owns 65% of our lands. Those lands are specifically designated for multiple use. And in Utah, we've built a thriving economy on these lands based around tourism, hunting, camping, wildlife, ranching, and energy development, among other uses. We manage our natural resources to ensure that Utahns get proper compensation for development on their land. Initially, the federal government sought the same goal. That's why the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 established fair compensation for natural resource development and statutorily enshrined the Bureau of Land Management to ensure fiscal responsibility for resources extracted on our public lands. However, the BLM has not updated its policy for properly compensating taxpayers in 100 years. That's decades of revenue that the public has lost. My bill would address a fiscal shortfall of our federal land, oil, and gas development by adjusting the royalty rates for onshore oil and gas production. Because these rates have not been modernized, the federal government has been shortchanging the taxpayers. My bill would adjust the rate to keep up with inflation and make the onshore rate consistent with offshore oil and gas development. Adjusting the rate to 18.75% keeps up with inflation, it stays current with other resource development, and provides a fair rate of return for the people who own these resources, namely the taxpayer. Additionally, my bipartisan legislation would update the minimum leasing bids and rental rates, which have not been adjusted in over 30 years. Last year alone, the United States leased more of our federal land than ever before, resulting in $1.1 billion in lease sales. I'm excited to see the U.S. continue to pursue energy independence, and I'm working to responsibly develop our natural resources. In Utah, energy is a $5.3 billion industry, and oil and gas development are a source of thousands of jobs. I believe that natural resource extraction is a vitally important part of our economy and our security as a nation. I also believe our taxpayers should get a fair return for the development of their federal land. My bipartisan bill would return millions of dollars to the taxpayer across the country. In Utah, my legislation would generate $72 million to the state of Utah in royalty rates alone. These dollars fund some of our most vital resources in our rural counties and towns. Oil and gas revenue funds such things as our rural schools, emergency preparedness and services, rural water development, and infrastructure projects. Because of the large amount of federal land in my state, many counties don't have the same property tax base as is available in some of our urban counties. This is an opportunity for rural counties and towns to get a fair payout for the development that's happening in their backyard. Utah's done a great job of updating rates as new oil and gas developers continue to choose Utah as a place to conduct their business. My bill follows the rate-setting lead of state and private landowners and ensures responsible energy development continues and boosts our rural economies. The money returned to the federal government goes into the Reclamation Fund, which goes back to the states to develop water infrastructure, power plants, and projects, and dams across the West. Last year, the Reclamation Fund received $1.2 billion from royalties alone. This fund helps projects like the Central Utah Water Project, which supplies culinary water across the rapidly growing Wasatch Front. And while some might interpret this legislation as harmful to oil and gas development, my legislation supports responsible energy development. I want to emphasize that the benefit from this legislation relies on consistent, robust, and responsible development of our natural resources. Without developing these resources and providing modern royalty and lease payments, our rural areas would not receive this important non-tax source of revenue for much-needed programs and services. During tight budget times, it's never a good idea to leave money on the table. That's true for federal, state, and county governments. My legislation, the Taxpayer Fairness for Resource Development Act, is a common-sense, bipartisan bill to fairly compensate the owners of these resources, the American public. I believe this bill can start the conversation about ensuring our taxpayers are getting a fair return for resources developed on public lands. I look forward to working with the members of this committee to pursue an all-of-the-above energy solution to ensure that America remains energy independent while making sure that taxpayers are given a fair shake. Again, I'd like to thank committee members, Ranking Member Gosar and Chairman Lowenthal for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of fiscal responsibility and to support our nation's economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative McAdams. Now we would normally be hearing from Representative Cartwright, representative from Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District and the original sponsor of H.R. 4435, the Coal Cleanup Taxpayer Protection Act. Mr. Cartwright is in another committee, so I've told him that when he arrives, he will be able to make his 5-minute presentation. I'd like now to introduce the panel, the second panel. You've already taken your seats and participated or listened to the first panel. I'm going to now yield to Representative DeGette to introduce 2 of this morning's witnesses, and then I'll return and introduce the others.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so proud we have 2 Coloradoans here as witnesses today. It shows how important these issues are to our state and how we consistently punch above our weight. So welcome to both of you. John Putnam serves as the Director for Environmental Programs for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. In that position, he's responsible for overseeing the air, water, waste, and environmental health and sustainability divisions of the department, and he serves as the department's representative on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Kathleen Skama is the president of the Western Energy Alliance, which is also based in Denver. Ms. Skama came to the Alliance in 2006. I'm so glad you're both here, and welcome to both of you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Where's the? Okay. Thank you, Ms. DeGette. I'd like to now introduce the remaining witnesses. First is Mr. Frank Rusco. He is the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Our fourth witness is Mr. Dan Bucks. Mr. Bucks is the former director for the Montana Department of Revenue and the former executive director for the Multi-State Tax Commission. And our final witness is Ms. Ryan Alexander. She is the president of Taxpayers for Common Sense. Let me remind the witnesses that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire testimony will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please complete your sentence. I'm going to allow the full panel to testify before having any questions from members of the committee, of the subcommittee. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rusco to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to testify before you today on GAO's work on Interior's management of oil and gas on federal lands in the context of the bills being discussed today. Since 2011, when Interior's oil and gas management was placed on GAO's high-risk list, we have continued to do oversight in Interior's management efforts and its efforts to address the issues that got them on the list. These issues, broadly, are related to the accuracy and amount of revenue collection, human capital challenges, and organizational issues. Interior has made progress in addressing our recommendations, but to get off the list, they will have to address the root causes of these problems and implement enterprise changes that, that will ensure that the agency is able to change and to address existing and future problems going forward. If they do this right, then federal lands will remain an attractive source of natural resources, and taxpayers will get a fair return for what is sold. With regard to the bills being discussed today, our work has identified relevant problems and made recommendations to Interior in 2 matters for congressional consideration to address them. For example, we have found that Interior lacks the ability to timely identify wells that have no future useful life and to ensure that operators or lessees of those wells do the required reclamation. Further, even when Interior does identify a well as abandoned, there is too frequently no financial viable party to pay for the reclamation, and the amount that is held in bonds is generally insufficient to pay for the work. As a result, taxpayers ultimately pay to reclaim these wells once Interior gets around to doing the work. On that note, Interior does not systematically request appropriations to reclaim abandoned wells and does not reclaim them systematically. As a result, the number of abandoned wells has increased over time, and many more wells may be abandoned but have not yet been identified as such by Interior. We recommend an increase in oil and gas bonds to create the incentive for companies to reclaim non-economic wells timely and to ensure money for BLM to do the reclamation if companies become insolvent. Alternatively, Congress could require BLM to collect funds from companies for reclamation, as some states do. With regard to coal bonding, the law allows states to let companies with sufficient assets and financial health self-bond rather than to put up actual assets as collateral or to buy a bond from a third party. We have found that this practice is difficult for federal and state entities to manage, and it makes it more likely that taxpayers will end up with reclamation liability. For example, in recent years, 3 large coal companies have declared bankruptcy, and between the 3, they were self-bonded to the tune of about $2 billion. It is unclear at this time if and how much of any reclamation costs may fall on taxpayers, but we recommend an end to self-bonding for coal companies because it is administratively complex and burdensome, and it puts the ultimate risk on taxpayers rather than companies with skin in the game. With regard to revenue collection, Interior has not used its authority to fully assess the terms under which it sells public oil and gas resources, and has not adjusted those terms to take into account market conditions, technological change, or factors affecting the uncertainty around resources in the ground and the costs of developing them. This contributes to the boom and bust nature of the oil and gas business and has left money on the table that could have gone to states and the federal treasury and reduced taxpayers' burden. We have recommended that Interior look at its lease terms and revenue collection holistically and determine if royalty rates and lease terms that have been largely static for many decades actually could represent a fair return to the public, given all the change that has occurred during these decades. Many other resource owners designed such fiscal systems to be robust to changing prices, costs, and uncertainty. Doing so places more risk on resource owners when there is a lot of uncertainty or when market conditions are unfavorable for oil and gas developers. In return, the owners take a bigger share of the returns when resources are more certain or market conditions are more favorable. With regard to methane capture, Interior's policies have not kept up with technology and have not ensured that when gas can be economically captured, it is done so. In contrast, some states that we have spoken with are far ahead of Interior in requiring gas to be captured and/or royalties paid on gas that is flared or vented in the air. This ends my oral statement. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Rusco. The chair now recognizes Mr. Putnam to testify.
Good morning, Mr. Lowenthal and members of the subcommittee. My name is John Putnam. I'm the Environmental Programs Director for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Also honored to serve as a member of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. I'm here today to provide testimony in support of the Methane Waste Prevention Act. Because energy production on public lands plays a large role in our nation's overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the Waste Prevention Act's cost-effective and common-sense strategies to reduce emissions are essential. The Act's prohibition on venting and its restriction on flaring preserve our valuable resources from waste and provide more revenue from taxpayers. They've been proven to work in the state of Colorado. And such measures are crucial in order to avoid the devastating impacts of climate change. Colorado experiences these impacts of climate change directly and is taking bold steps to ensure that all Coloradans have clean air and that future generations have a livable climate. Unfortunately, methane and associated hydrocarbon emissions do not stop at state lines, and our state is particularly susceptible to the impacts of climate change. Colorado is vulnerable to drought, wildfires, flooding, and ozone exacerbation. As a headwaters state providing 19 states and the country of Mexico with water from our snowpack, this is an essential national issue. Given the international cumulative nature of climate change, Colorado has a fundamental interest in regulating methane emissions on a national level. Colorado promulgated the country's first methane emissions reduction rules in 2014 and continues to improve them with better technology and understanding of emissions. The methane emissions restrictions in the Act are modeled on Colorado's nationally leading rules. Colorado's experience shows that reductions in venting, flaring, and fugitive emissions can be achieved alongside growth in the oil and gas industry. Our program has reduced emissions of methane and volatile organic compounds by hundreds of thousands of tons per year, while still allowing for growth in the oil and gas sector. As proof of the efficacy of Colorado's regulations, reported data indicate that there's been a continued year-over-year reduction in the number of leaking components identified since the rules were enacted in 2014. Moreover, ambient monitoring data from oil and gas producing regions has shown a significant reduction in hydrocarbons since 2012, including a 55% reduction in volatile organic hydrocarbons from 2012 to 2018 in Weld County, Colorado's largest oil and gas producing county. This significant decline in overall VOC emissions has occurred while oil and gas production has more than tripled. Colorado's experience is an example of the kind of progress that's possible when regulators and leaders from industry, the environmental community, and governments come together around common sense policies and protect our air and fiscal responsibility. However, our work is not done. In addition to this bill, a bill signed by Governor Jared Polis in this year's legislative session is building on this success. Senate Bill 181 includes direction to minimize emissions, including methane and hydrocarbons from oil and gas development. This is critical because oil and gas sector is the largest source of VOCs contributing to Denver's ozone non-attainment, soon to be downgraded to serious status. Oil and gas VOCs also drive ozone levels in western Colorado that are just barely below the federal ozone standards. We share our air sheds and our oil and gas basins with neighboring states, and the quality of our air depends on what happens on both sides of state lines. Methane emissions from the sector are also a large proportion of our greenhouse gas inventory and must be reduced in order for the state and country to meet greenhouse gas reduction targets. Colorado supports the Methane Waste Prevention Act's bold yet achievable goals to capture gas produced on public lands. We're encouraged to see successful elements of our own regulatory program incorporated into the Act, such as low and no bleed pneumatic controllers, regularly scheduled leak detection, and prompt repair of leaks. The waste of natural gas on public lands is an urgent, widely documented problem. According to a recent report by the USGS, between 2009 and 2015, oil and gas operations on federal lands wasted 462 billion cubic feet of natural gas, enough to serve 6.2 million households for a year. By preventing venting and restricting flaring on federal lands, the Methane Waste Prevention Act will prevent waste, generate revenue for taxpayers, and take necessary steps to address climate change. In closing, Colorado appreciates this opportunity to lend our support to the bold and cost-effective measures. Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Representative DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Putnam. The chair now recognizes Ms. Scamma to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Mr. Chairman, I assure you that operating on federal lands is no sweetheart deal. In fact, I represent 300 companies, many of whom operate on federal lands in the West. And much as we would like to avoid federal lands, we can't in the West because of the interlocking land ownership and mineral ownership. But many of our members do specifically avoid federal lands because the bottom line is that they are just not competitive with adjacent private and state lands or competitive with other areas of the country like Pennsylvania, like the Permian Basin in Texas, which do not have federal lands, and as a result can do things like command a higher royalty rate. So the reason that the royalty rate is set as it is because the federal government has chosen to extract more cost through the regulatory obstacles and regime and additional process on federal lands which of course there should be additional processes on federal lands because all Americans own them. And, but that federal process is so onerous, and these three bills would make it even more costly and more difficult to operate on federal lands. So they would not have the effect of increasing royalties. They would have the effect of decreasing revenues because they just would continue to make federal lands less competitive with non-federal lands. So right now we see a balance on federal lands. It's not perfect. Mr. Rusko's report has certainly pointed out several areas where BLM is not doing well enough, doesn't have the correct data to manage everything that they're supposed to. And so I would suggest that it would be better for Congress to look at more innovative solutions, just like we in the industry innovate constantly. For example, we innovate, and over 4 decades, we have a trend of reducing methane emissions, even while we've increased natural gas by over 50%, oil production over 80%. We've enabled the United States to become the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world. We're very proud of that. We're very proud of the fact that we've cushioned the consumer from the largest historical shock to the oil supply ever. And that's the taking out of about 50% of Saudi Arabia's capacity. And yet the consumer has barely felt that at the pump because of the strength of the American producer. So we develop that oil and natural gas in a responsible manner. We continue to meet every legitimate environmental challenge, reducing our air emissions, reducing our methane emissions, reducing water use. We've shrunk the footprint on the land by 70% because of horizontal drilling and clustering of well pads. So we've met every legitimate environmental challenge, and it's actually not true that the small leaks from oil and natural gas production outweighs the benefit that we deliver in the electricity sector, where greenhouse gas emissions are 10 times what they are at the production sites. So we are the #1 reason the United States has reduced greenhouse gases more than any other country. And we've done more than wind and solar combined to reduce greenhouse gases. So we're very proud of that record. But taken together, these bills would continue to make federal lands less competitive, would return less to the federal government, and the hearing title that this is a giveaway to the industry when we return $9.7 billion in royalties alone to the federal government. What we return on public lands pays for everything that BLM does on federal lands 19 times over. So for every dollar BLM spends administering the onshore program, we return $19.17. So we've more than provided enough money to support education in the states and support infrastructure, but also to administer the entire program and do things like reclaim those wells for a very few bad actors that do not reclaim their wells. The vast majority of wells are reclaimed responsibly by the responsible owner. So I would just point out that rather than these types of bills, I would suggest that BLM could look at outsourcing the bonding requirements, that the deficiencies that Mr. Rusko pointed out in his report. Rather than just knee-jerk raising the bonding amounts, how about Congress look at outsourcing that function like a collections agency, which are much more aggressive and would do a better job than BLM tracking those at-risk wells and going after those funds. So that's my idea, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Ms. Gamma. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bucks to testify.
Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to discuss federal oil and gas issues with you today. For decades, the federal government has failed to provide a fair return to the American people on the oil and gas resources they own. The Department of Interior has neglected to update lease bids, rental fees, and royalty rates as market and production conditions change, thus denying the public billions of dollars owed to them. Instead, Interior has given those billions as an improper subsidy and windfall to oil and gas companies. Although it has authority to increase rates, Interior has updated neither lease bids nor rental fees to adjust for inflation. So Congress finds itself every 2 or 3 decades needing to step in and change the rates instead. The last time was in 1987, when Congress raised the minimum bids to $2 per acre. Today, those two 1987 are worth only 87 cents. Mr. Chairman, much less than what you can get a cup of coffee for. I have to pay for a cup of coffee today. You're correct. The initial $1.50 per acre rental fee, also set in 1987, is now worth only 65 cents. So H.R. 4364 is needed to once again update minimum bids and rentals. However, under this bill, Congress will wisely require Interior to update these rates for inflation once every 4 years. That is a key step because Interior has proven that left to its own devices, it will not protect the revenue that should be paid to the American people, but will instead unjustly enrich oil and gas companies. But the picture gets even worse. Interior has imposed the greatest fiscal damage on the public by not even once in a century increasing the 12.5% onshore oil and gas royalty rate. Producers are only entitled to a share of oil and gas receipts to cover their extraction costs and a normal profit. Because of continuously improving technology, extraction costs per unit of production have declined. So rightfully, over time, the producer's share of receipts should get smaller, and the owner's share should increase through higher royalty rates. This is what should happen. By failing to raise royalties, however, Interior is giving oil and gas companies revenue that belongs instead to the American people. Now, states with their own state lands and resources do a far better job of securing a fair return for their citizens. In the West and South, the median state oil and gas royalty is 19.375%. For over 30 years, Texas, the largest oil-producing state, has charged a 25% royalty. Louisiana, a major gas producer, has negotiated average royalty rates exceeding 23% for more than 40 years. Colorado and New Mexico have raised their rates to 20%. And at the same time, both leasing and production is booming in those areas. With its 12.5% rate, Interior is giving away at least every third barrel of oil and every third cubic foot of gas to fossil fuel companies absolutely free of charge as compared to the states. Now, states increase royalty rates to achieve fairness for their citizens and secure revenue for vital services such as education. But they have done even more for us. States have taught us that increasing royalty rates yields more revenue but does not reduce oil and gas production. And studies cited by the GAO also indicate that higher federal royalties will increase revenues with only negligible impacts on oil and gas produced. 4364 will increase the onshore royalty rate to 18.75% on new leases only, a conservative and long overdue step. Importantly, this bill establishes a regular royalty evaluation and reporting process that will encourage Interior to keep future royalty rates up to date and strengthen congressional oversight of royalty issues. This bill also makes other needed improvements in the fiscal system, especially by requiring all methane produced to be subject to royalties. As discussed in my written testimony, this and related bills pending before this committee have great merit and should move forward after your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you,
Good morning.
Mr. Bucks. And, I'm sorry, Chair now recognizes Ms. Alexander, who's very excited about testing.
Yes, it's always exciting to go last. Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, Representatives DeGette, Westerman, and Hearn, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today on the Taxpayer Fairness for Resource Development Act, the Bonding Reform and Taxpayer Protection Act, the Coal Cleanup and Taxpayer Protection Act, and the Methane Waste Prevention Act. Taxpayers for Common Sense is a national nonpartisan budget watchdog. For nearly 25 years, TCS has worked to fight corporate welfare, wasteful spending and tax breaks, and to ensure that taxpayers receive a fair return on all resources extracted from or developed from federal lands and waters. This includes oil, gas, coal, hard rock minerals, wind, solar, and timber. The current fiscal policies of the Department of Interior are in desperate need of reform. Taxpayers lose revenue as a result of obsolete policies from inappropriately low minimum bids and rents, non-competitive leasing practices, below-market royalty rates, operating practices that waste valuable methane, and outdated bonding requirements. Today's minimum bid for securing a federal oil and gas lease at auction was set in 1987 and was intended to be in place for 2 years. The Taxpayer Fairness and Development Act raises the current minimum bid from $2 an acre to $5 an acre, pegged to inflation, a step that's long overdue. The Mineral Leasing Act requires private leaseholders to pay annual rent. Unfortunately for taxpayers, rental rates, also set in 1987, have not kept pace with inflation, losing tens of millions of dollars in revenue every year. Current rental rates now yield less than half of the inflation-adjusted rate. We support H.R. 4364, which would increase rental rates from the initial $1.50 per acre for the first 5 years to $3 an acre, and from $2 an acre every year thereafter to $5 an acre. BLM's failure to raise royalty rates on oil and gas production for the minimum amount of 12% set by Congress a century ago is perhaps the most glaring example of fiscal mismanagement. Congress should raise the rate from 12.5% to 18.75% as included in the Taxpayer Fairness and Resource Development Act. Taxpayers should be paid rates consistent with those charged on state and private lands, which are as high as 25%. TCS recently completed in-depth analysis of the oil and gas leasing systems on federal lands in Utah, Nevada, and New Mexico. In Utah, if BLM's onshore royalty rate had been raised to 18.75%, state and federal taxpayers would have received at least $1.4 billion more in additional oil and gas revenues from 2008 to 2017. In New Mexico, numbers were even higher, with the state and federal taxpayers losing $5 billion in foregone revenue. Taxpayers also lose money as a result of BLM allowing operators to use and waste valuable methane gas without paying royalties. Our own analyses since 2014 show existing oil and gas management practices have led to the dramatic undercollection of royalties owed to federal taxpayers. The 216 billion cubic feet operators reported venting and flaring from 2008 to 2017 was worth an estimated $890 million. Yet just $21 million in royalties was collected on that reported lost gas, an effective royalty rate of 2.4%. TCS supports the reinstatement of the 2016 BLM methane waste rule until new rules are implemented that require increased capture, prohibit venting in most cases, and require leak detection and repair, among other things, as required by the Methane Waste and Prevention Act. TCS also supports the requirement for measurement rather than estimation of all gas volumes, installation of metering devices, and the application of civil penalties and other enforcement mechanisms when releases take place. Finally, after years of digging piecemeal through DOI data sets, we very much support readily available transparent methane data, as we would for all federal data. In addition to the under-market rates during leasing, taxpayers are also left with the tab to clean up abandoned wells. Current rates were set in the 50s and 60s, as Chairman Lowenthal said, and are obsolete. In its report published last week, the GAO identified 2,294 inactive wells currently at risk of becoming orphaned, for which reclamation costs could total $46 million. TCS supports H.R. 4346, which would increase minimum BLL oil and gas bond amounts from $10,000 to $50,000 for all operated wells in an individual lease, $25,000 to $250,000 for all wells held at a state level, and $150,000 to $1 million for all wells held nationwide, and importantly, requires these amounts to be adjusted for inflation. It's never a good idea to leave money on the table, least of all at a time when the country faces a $22 trillion debt. Federal lands and waters must be used responsibly, and taxpayers must receive appropriate payment and financial assurances from those companies benefiting from resource extraction. These problems must be resolved as we move forward with additional energy production on federal lands and waters.
Thank you, Ms. Alexander. And that completes the testimony of the panel, and I want to thank the panel for your testimony. want to remind members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes, but before I begin, I do have to leave, and so I'm going to yield, and I will hope to be back soon, but I will yield my 5 minutes to Ms. DeGette, and come on up.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Colorado's been a national leader in methane waste policy for years, as you told us, Mr. Putnam. And some people have said that the BLM shouldn't be regulating methane emissions or fracking or practically anything because they view it as an attack on the sovereignty of the states. And they feel like it keeps the states from regulating oil and gas in the way they believe best. Now, if any state would have a stake in the methane waste issue, it would be Colorado. And so I want to ask you, Mr. Putnam, did federal regulation of oil and gas operations hamper Colorado's ability to regulate methane emissions?
Thank you, Representative Gett. The answer is no, that Colorado was able to effectively regulate methane waste and the air pollution associated with that underneath its own authority. That being said, I think stronger federal regulation on BLM property will assist the states in appropriately regulating this issue. We share air seds, we share basins, and much of the planning that's necessary to most effectively reduce methane waste relates to the infrastructure that would be in place, the pipeline capacity, so forth. And so if BLM's doing that work, it makes it much easier for the states to do this.
So in other words, what you're saying, if the federal government sets a minimum standard for methane emissions from oil and gas, that helps the individual states then set their own policies?
Absolutely.
Now, let me ask you the flip side of that question. When the federal government deregulates, just like this administration has been when they rolled back the BLM and EPA methane waste rules, how does that impact states like Colorado?
I think it affects us in two ways. One, it requires us to do more as the federal government is doing less. But at the same time, the airsheds don't respect boundaries. We're still subject to air coming in from other states. We need a national standard on these issues because we share a national resource.
Thank you. Continuing with you, Mr. Putnam, in 2014, Colorado was the first state that implemented methane regulations in the oil and gas sector. And in fact, this fact sheet that I entered into the record from the Colorado Oil and Gas Association said, quote, Colorado has led the nation in creating some of the most stringent air regulations in the U.S. And I think industry in Colorado, for the most part, appeared to appreciate the state's leadership in preventing methane waste. I'd like to know from your perspective, Mr. Putnam, how has the industry in Colorado responded to our regulation of methane waste?
I think it's important to note to begin with that the leading oil and gas industries actually worked with us to develop those regulations and make them workable across the industry. And I think the proof is in the pudding. Production has increased since those regulations took place, since they were strengthened in 2017. And we're continuing the process of working with industry to further tighten those rules with respect to new technology and new information about the emission sources.
And did after Colorado enacted these stringent standards, did we see an exodus of oil and gas companies to neighboring states with less stringent rules like Wyoming or Utah?
No, we didn't. We saw an increase in activity in the state of Colorado.
And why do you think that was?
I think the activities are driven more by the economics and geology. The regulations were not onerous. They are common sense and they work well for industry.
And Do you think that if other states around us, like Wyoming or Utah, enacted similar regulations, that the companies in those states would have difficulty meeting those regulations?
I don't believe they would because it's saving product at the end of the day, and they benefit from having the infrastructure in place to comply with these rules.
Now, I want to turn to you very briefly, Mr. Rusko. In 2011, the GAO included the Department of Interior's management of federal oil and gas resources on its list of operations that are, quote, high risk due to their vulnerabilities for fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. Now, unfortunately, in 2019, Interior management of federal oil and gas resources is still on that risk list. Could you explain a little bit more about what it means to be on that list?
Yes, there are 35 programs or activities, federal activities, out of the many hundreds of programs and activities that are on the high-risk list. To get on the high-risk list, there has to be serious, long-standing, and unresolved deficiencies found in multiple GAO reports. And there also has to be a significant fiscal effect in general. So with oil and gas management, we have found for many, many years that Interior has not managed this in an effective and efficient way, and in particular, they have not done things like revise regulations that are decades old when the industry is changing all around them and where the resources that people are looking for are changing all around them.
Thank you. The chair's time's expired, and I'll now recognize Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I'm looking at a CRS report that was generated on October 23rd, 2018. I'm reading from the report here that says non-federal crude oil production rapidly increased in the past few years, primarily due to improved extraction technologies, favorable geology, and the ease of leasing, more than doubling daily production between fiscal year 2008 and fiscal year 2017. The federal share of total U.S. crude oil production fell from its peak at nearly 36% in 2009 to less than 24% in 2017. At the same time, overall production increased. Natural gas production in the United States overall has steadily increased since 2008. In contrast, production on federal lands declined each year from 2009 through 2017. Now, I had many of the same concerns that you all have voiced about why do we have such low royalty rates on federal lands. And Mr. Bucks, I think you stated in your testimony that states do a better job in securing higher royalty rates for their citizens. I would absolutely, totally agree with that states do a better job obtaining higher royalty rates. Private landowners obtain higher royalty rates. So I asked the question, if it's such a good deal on federal land, then why aren't we seeing increases in production on federal lands? If you've got this sweetheart deal of 12.5% on federal lands versus 20 or 25% on non-federal lands, what is it that causes people to do more development on private lands? And with the backlog and maintenance that we have on our federal lands, I thought, why don't we do something to get the federal royalty rates up comparable to private and state rates and take that money and put it into maintenance and backlog on federal lands. So I went out and started doing my own investigation on that. And first off, concerned about the environment, I asked people who are in this business, I said, if you take me to a site that was permitted under federal guidelines versus a site that was permitted under state guidelines, would there be any noticeable environmental differences? And they said, no, you wouldn't be able to tell on a production rig who permitted it. Both are safe, they're protecting the environment. But to go through the permitting process on federal lands may take years, and it costs a lot more money to get a permit on federal lands. So the reason the royalties are low is because the cost to do business on federal lands is so much higher. So my question would be, is if we could let states permit production on federal lands in exchange for getting higher rates and protect the environment at the same time, would that not be a good deal? Ms. Sagama, I'll let you open with that, and then anybody else who would like to address it.
Thank you, Representative. I think you're onto something there, and that's my point, in that the federal government has decided to extract more cost from on the regulatory and process side than it can extract in the royalty side, just because there's just years more process. So your idea is a great one. If states, which can permit so much more efficiently, could have that delegated authority to permit on federal lands as well, that certainly would go a long way to making federal lands more competitive. But it wouldn't take all the process away, because the permitting is kind of the last leg before you can develop a well. Before then, you have to go through years of environmental review, and your leases take longer to get on federal lands. There's environmental review that just can drag out for years and years. So that would be part of the process, and it's certainly on the right track.
And Mr. Boakes, would you like to add to that?
Representative Westerman, I would turn it around and say, first of all, that whatever the trends are in federal leasing, and there can be different conditions that apply at different periods of time, depending upon what choices the administrations had taken, an approach they had taken to how much to lease and whatever on federal lands at any given point in time. But the policy of providing massive royalty subsidies and undervalued lease rates has simply not resulted in increasing production. In fact, it has very little to do with production. I have a couple of maps I'd like to take a look at in terms of patterns of production over the long term. On these, if you can see this, I have to crane my neck because the TV is not in here, in front of me. But you'll notice that this is a map of where there are oil and gas leases on federal lands, and there's certainly no shortage of leases that are available, and the producing leases are in the pink color. And you'll notice that where the production is on federal lands exactly overlaps where there's production on private and state lands. And there's no evidence of avoidance of production on federal lands versus state lands for any purpose. And we'll take another look for a second map, looking down at the Permian Basin in an area of oil and gas development in both Texas and New Mexico. And what you see here is the blue land is state land, the beige land is BLM land, and the blank land or white-colored land is private land. And you'll see the pattern of development there. It spreads in equal density across federal lands in the beige in the northwest and the state lands into the east and the south. The only area where there's evidence of drilling is in a block of private land in the west, private land, neither state nor federal, where apparently a landowner doesn't want to have drilling or there's some condition on it, the drilling can't occur, so the wells occur right on the border around it. So there really isn't any evidence that over the long term, and I can't speak to the specific periods, that royalty rates, regulations, whatever, have any effect. The drilling occurs across the board where the oil and gas deposits occur.
The gentleman's time is well expired.
Madam Chair, I would just like to submit this CSR report to the record that also states that...
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now, according to the announcement by Chairman Lowenthal, recognizes Mr. Cartwright from Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District and the original co-sponsor of House Resolution 4435, the Coal Cleanup Taxpayer Protection Act, for his opening statement. And welcome, Mr. Cartwright. 5 minutes.
I thank my colleague, Representative DeGette, and Chairman Lowenthal, and all the witnesses here today for giving us your time to discuss the glaring flaws in the current coal bonding procedures. I'd also like to thank my colleague and friend, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, for her support and her work with me on the Coal Cleanup Taxpayer Protection Act. That's an act that closes dangerous loopholes in the coal bonding process. It's a bill that helps guarantee that the companies that benefit from mining coal clean up after themselves and don't leave our communities suffering and paying for reclamation. It's legislation based on recommendations from the mining regulatory authorities of the 13 states with active mines. My own state of Pennsylvania has more abandoned mines than any other state in the Union. Many of these mines were left by coal companies that ceased operations in the first half of the 20th century, but we're still working to clean these sites up in 2019, and we have a long way to go. 1977, Congress passed SMCRA, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, protecting states with active coal mines from suffering the same fate as Pennsylvania. It was supposed to make sure that coal companies, not taxpayers, paid to clean up their mess. But after more than 40 years of reclamation, we still have $10 billion to go to clean up existing sites, and my bill will help us avoid unnecessarily adding more sites to that already long list. Now, we've seen time and time again that the failure to clean up these hazardous sites has negative consequences that can haunt communities for decades, including blighted landscapes, poisoned water, dangerous high walls and sinkholes, and economic stagnation. Reclaiming mined lands protects the health and safety of those who live among them and enables these communities to use that land for new business ventures, creating jobs long after the mines close. SMCRA requires mining companies to provide a financial guarantee before they start tearing up the earth. It's supposed to ensure that the company will restore the land to livable condition after the mining operation is all over with. Now, under current law, the cost of this reclamation can be guaranteed through traditional bonding approaches such as surety bonds and collateral, or alternative approaches such as self-bonding and pool bonding. Now, a self-bond is merely a promise to pay reclamation costs, not backed by sureties, not backed by collateral. This is an approach that might have made sense when coal companies were some of the most valuable businesses in the world, but we all know times have changed dramatically. In the last 6 months alone, Revelation Energy, Black Jewel, Cambrian Coal LLC, and Cloud Peak Energy have all filed for bankruptcy. In fact, since 2012, more than 44% of coal produced in the U.S. came from a company that has filed for bankruptcy. With the coal industry struggling, stock prices collapsing, and coal debt at alarming levels, self-bonding just no longer makes any sense. The Coal Cleanup Taxpayer Protection Act closes this loophole by eliminating the practice of self-bonding. Now, another questionable alternative bonding approach is pool bonding that I mentioned, in which multiple companies pay a portion of their anticipated reclamation costs into a common pool. These funds are used in the event of bankruptcy to clean up abandoned mines, but most bond pools do not have enough funds to cover reclamation if multiple companies go bankrupt at the same time, which is a common occurrence, given the interrelated financial troubles coal companies simultaneously face and the precarious state of that industry. With the bond pool insolvent, the costs of reclamation fall to the American taxpayer. My bill requires each state submit an actuarial study demonstrating the solvency of a proposed bond pool and perform a subsequent study every 5 years thereafter. Finally, even collateral bonding has proven risky for the taxpayer. When the value of the property or equipment falls dramatically, as we have seen in several instances recently, my bill requires the disclosure of any appraisal or valuation of real property or equipment used for bonding purposes, and clarifies that bonding collateral that is not liquid must be revalued at least every 3 years. Together, these reforms ensure that those who profit off the land are held responsible for cleaning up after themselves and restoring environmental and economic viability to former mining communities. I thank the Chairwoman Pro Tem for considering this bill at this hearing today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Hearn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and Republican Leader Gosar, and our witnesses for being here today. As you all know, oil and gas are each essential to the American energy sector, and as they provide a reliable source of power and employment for hundreds of thousands of Americans. And in spite of this, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have continually opposed these developments as part of their Green New Deal initiative and their war on fossil fuels. It's duly noted. And they have pushed an irresponsible agenda which would have devastating consequences to our energy sector and all those high-paying jobs. And based on this legislation before us today, it's clear that they're aiming to further build upon this radical socialist agenda. This is because these pieces of legislation will ensure less oil and gas production on federal lands, by making the production less cost competitive, creating more bureaucratic reviews, and increasing red tape. For example, my colleague, Mr. McAdams, has a bill before us today, H.R. 4364, that would, according to Mr. McAdams, this bill would return, quote, return more money to taxpayers by raising royalty rates on oil and gas production on federal lands, end quote. This may sound great, but in reality, raising the rates will hurt competitiveness in the oil and gas marketplace and discourage development on our federal lands, therefore reducing production and reducing any actual return to the taxpayers. My question is to Mr. Gama. As president of the Western Energy Alliance, you have a great deal of expertise on all of this. You spoke to it in your testimony. Can you explain to us in the committee how these proposals will make these projects less competitive and how these could actually hurt the return to the American taxpayers?
Thank you, Congressman. All taken together, these just increase costs on federal lands. And as Mr. Westerman pointed out, the share on federal lands continues to decrease even as we're increasing production throughout the United States dramatically. So you have things like raising costs directly, raising royalty rates, rents and bonuses, and then raising the money tied up in bonds, additional regulatory process, which is already, I'd point out, redundant. Ms. DeGette's bill is redundant with the EPA regulations already in place, even with the proposed changes to them, as well as the BLM just doesn't have the authority to regulate air quality, so it would be making that fatal flaw from the Obama administration, which was giving a non-air quality regulator, i.e. the BLM, the authority to regulate air, which is the domain of EPA and the states. So all taken together, all these additional regulatory costs plus the direct additional costs would further erode the competitiveness of public lands. And this thought that it's a subsidy is a direct payment to a producer. We do not get direct subsidies. In fact, we return $9.7 billion from offshore and onshore oil and gas to the taxpayer every year. So there's no giveaway going on here, as the title of this hearing would suggest. We return billions of dollars, not just in royalties, rents, and bonuses, but corporate income taxes, the wages we pay, return income taxes. So we more than pay for everything that BLM does to administer the program. In fact, we do that 19 times over. Thank you for the question.
You bet, and thank you for your answer. And unfortunately, my colleague's wrong-footed war on fossil fuels doesn't stop there. Another example of this agenda is the chairwoman's bill, H.R. 2711. This bill would codify an Obama-era BLM rule from 2016, which is commonly known as the bending and flaring rule. And thankfully, certainly from our perspective, the administration revised this rule and reduced the redundant compliance burdens, as you've spoken to. And there's no shortage of opportunity for our colleagues to bash that. But also, they neglect to mention, as was mentioned in one of the testimonies, that less than 1% of natural gas is flared in the United States. And the U.S. emissions today are 15% lower than they were in 1990. And even though our domestic production has increased over 50% during that same time period. And, could you talk about how this particular bill could hurt the industry as well?
Well, it's redundant with EPA regulations. So I would just like to point out that EPA regulations, of course, apply on federal lands as they do on non-federal lands, just as state regulation also, state air quality regulation also applies on federal land. So having the state of Colorado asking the federal government to do what it's already doing just doesn't make any sense.
May I stop you there? We're running out of time here. I just want to point out, and you alluded to this, how important our our energy production is into sustaining our national security. And we're seeing this right now with what went on in Saudi Arabia, what went on in Venezuela. The American people don't recognize it because there's no increase at the pump. And we couldn't have done this 5 years ago. Thank you so much. Madam Chairwoman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Cartwright, who's a member of this subcommittee, for 5 minutes for purposes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start with you, Ms. Alexander. You mentioned in your written testimony 3 of the largest coal companies in America, all of which were self-bonded, declared bankruptcy in 2015 and 2016. How will these and similar bankruptcies impact the public if these companies are unable to pay for their reclamation costs?
Well, as a starting point, if the companies are unable to pay for the reclamation costs, it'll just fall on the taxpayers. It's just another expense that we'll own. And I think the other thing is that if there's not a clear reclamation plan, it's not paid for by the company, it's going to slow down, and that'll increase the potential harms both to water quality, depending on what the nature of the mine is.
Can you share any examples of how a self-bonded company declaring bankruptcy has already negatively impacted American taxpayers?
Not really. I would do it and it would be inaccurate. I'm sorry. Okay. I mean, I think that if you look at the 3 huge, there were very big coal producers, and their bankruptcies left lots of sites unreclaimed. Okay. I just don't want to go into detail and be wrong, as I might be if I did right now.
Well, now, given the low number of outstanding self-bonds and current affordability of surety bonds, why is ending self-bonding particularly urgent and timely right now?
I think it's urgent and timely right now because of the changing nature of the coal industry. It's not. It's a very volatile time for the coal industry. There's taking, as what you called it, a promise to pay, a snapshot of a balance sheet at a certain time as assurance that cleanup will take place doesn't make sense. It's not what the market looks like. It's not what the coal companies look like, and it doesn't protect taxpayers.
Okay, Mr. Rusko, we're interested in government accountability, and you're our government accountability witness today. Can you walk us through the challenges faced by state and federal agencies tasked with regulating self-bonded companies?
Yes, so, first to determine whether a company can be eligible for self-bonding, the states would have to understand the financial viability of the firm. So that has gotten more and more complicated over time as companies have broadened their scope of activities, and that's not the kind of thing that state and federal regulators are good at. So it's a burdensome process for them, and then they would have to track that over time and be able to predict when those companies are going to have trouble, but they'd have to predict ahead of when they had trouble so that the companies would then have the resources if they wanted to remove the self-bond and actually tie the reclamation to some actual assets or a surety company.
It turns the government into credit examiners, doesn't it?
It's not what they're good at.
It's not what they're good at. Now, in August of 2016, the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement issued a policy advisory directing state mining regulatory authorities not to issue permits for any new self-bonds. This advisory was withdrawn in October of 2017, and you're aware of that. Do you agree with that office's decision to withdraw that policy?
Well, we recommend that self-bonding be ended. We think it puts taxpayer money at risk, and so we don't agree with that.
Do you know why the policy was withdrawn? Do you know? Why do you think it was withdrawn?
I don't know.
Okay. Now, a 2016 GAO report in your agency found out that coal companies are the only onshore industry allowed to self-bond. Self-bonding was eliminated for hard rock mining back in 2001. any reason to believe that coal mining operations would not be subject to the same self-bonding risks as hard rock mining and other onshore operations?
Commodities markets are volatile. Commodity industries are boom and bust. So if you're going to go and look for money during a bust, when companies are going out of business, then you're going to be out of luck.
And the taxpayers are going to be out of luck, right?
That's correct.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Gosar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Alexander, you couldn't come up with a case, could you? There is not one on record for self-bonding, right?
Actually, my staff helped me out in the interim, and the Alpha bankruptcy left $400 million in reclamation liabilities in Wyoming and West Virginia.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Roscoe?
We have not looked at that.
Mr. Roscoe, the whole fact that this is very complicated and people have to, the oversight has to be dwelled in. It also gives regulators a better insight as to the business model. And so from that standpoint, I think they understand the business acuity and financial status of those mining companies. So I think there's an offset to that application in regards to self-bonding. Ms. Sagama, we're going to go back in and start looking at the map that we saw up here. Time is money, right?
Absolutely.
So one oil company does one rig at a time, right?
Well, I mean, it depends on the size of the company, but no, companies can have several rigs running.
So they manage a portfolio, right? Mm-hmm. So they have private, state, and federal, right?
Yes.
So they could be doing all at the same time, because what's happening is you're utilizing the state and private sectors to, as you have to go longer times to get permitting for federal lands. Is that true?
So a company will definitely try to develop their non-federal assets before their federal assets, just because they can get them done earlier. If I look at that map, I see that the fact that BLM lands are definitely avoided compared to the non-federal lands there. That's the way I read that map, although I haven't really had a chance to study it. So with the long horizontals, the long laterals we now have with horizontal drilling, it's very hard in certain areas to avoid federal land, because you can start on non-federal land and your lateral may touch federal or Indian minerals along that 1 to 2 mile lateral. So that results in federal mineral estate often holds up the non-federal estate as well.
I guess that's my point, is that you have different projects at different stages.
Yes.
It's kind of like a dental office. You know, you have somebody coming in as a patient for initial exam. You have somebody coming in for an extraction as an emergency. You have a long prosthetic case that's been building for time. So it's a portfolio that you manage, right?
Absolutely. And because your federal permits take so much longer, you actually have to request federal permits months to years longer than you would from a state permit.
Yeah, I had to bring that up just because I see all the bureaucrats with their eyes lighting up for more money, and that's not necessarily the case. So now let's get back into this flaring for methane. It's been cited over and over again. Is there any other pertinent information you'd like to give us in regards to flaring of methane?
Sure. I think North Dakota is a great example. They have a gas capture plan that started out at 85%, and they're working towards 93% gas capture. And that's a realistic number based on several things. There's natural reasons, there are safety reasons, there's maintenance. You know, your pipeline can be down for maintenance, your gas processing plant may be down for maintenance. There are reasons that flaring has to occur, and there are reasons venting has to occur sometimes for safety reasons. And so North Dakota is a great example of a reasonable plan by the states, which are the proper place to regulate air quality, where they've got this plan to get to 93% capture. And that's a realistic plan based on just operational, what happens in the field. So I think North Dakota is a great example, and it's not true that other states don't regulate. I think that's been the implication here, is that Colorado is the only one. Wyoming has strict regulations. Their flaring rates are well under, I think, about 1/4 of a percentage point. So other states regulate as well.
Infrastructure is an important part to that. I mean,
You know, that's a great
you know,
point.
and I just want to bring up before you finish, you know, methane is released in regards to dump sites for every city and town. And so infrastructure would be an absolute great aspect for capture because it's a commodity. Please expand.
Absolutely. And that's what we've seen in North Dakota as well, is that often the federal government is the reason we have to flare for longer time periods because we can't get the rights of way to put in the gas gathering lines or the pipelines, or we have environmental groups that want to make sure that we stop all pipelines so that there's actually situations where we have to flare much longer, years longer, because we can't get the permits to put that in gas gathering into
Thank you,
place.
Ms. Gamma.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Mr. Rusko, during my last line of questioning, we were talking about the high-risk list, that Interior Management of Federal Oil and Gas Resources is still on that high-risk list, and you were talking about what it means to be on that list. I wanted to ask you, has the Department of Interior taken steps to address the GAO's concerns in this direction?
Yes, the department has closed many of the recommendations we've made under the high-risk work. They've also taken some steps backwards recently. So with regards to the capture of methane, which is, we found and many studies have found can be economically captured in most cases for as far as leaks detection and repair. The BLM had issued a rule that would have done that. It's not an environmental rule. It's a rule to capture methane and collect it and sell it and collect royalties on it.
Right,
And
so they rolled back that rule, but it's really just an economical issue, it seems to me, as well as.
in many cases it
Yeah.
is.
Mr. Putnam, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to expand on that?
I would like to expand on that. In my role as an Oil and Gas Conservation Commissioner, a fundamental principle is the principle of waste. And so as the owner of those resources, BLM should have the obligation to prevent waste. And part of that waste is to keep it in the pipe and used for beneficial purpose and is not vented to the atmosphere. If we had the same level of waste with a liquid fuel like crude and just spilled it all over, I don't think we'd be having this conversation because it'd be solved by now.
And you know, we keep hearing, well, but industry's taking all these steps to become even more efficient. But does that mean that we shouldn't try to avoid this waste?
No, I think industry needs the guidance of regulations, and we've had that experience ourselves to get to that place. And the current regulations, the current status is not sufficient to address either greenhouse gas or other air quality issues, let alone the pure waste-related issues, which is where government, and particularly the owner of these resources, should step in to prevent it.
Ms. Alexander, in your testimony, you pointed out that natural gas consumed within the area, an area leased to an oil and gas driller, is not assessed a royalty. Could you explain how this creates a perverse disincentive for operators to modernize their equipment and reduce the waste of methane?
Sure. So the question you're talking about is the beneficial use rule, which allows oil and gas operators to power their operations with methane. They don't pay a royalty on that, which means that they have no incentive to reduce their use of that. It's also, it's again something that while we'd rather have them use it than release it into the atmosphere, we still should get paid for it. It's,
Right.
you know.
Do you have an estimate of how much this costs to taxpayers?
We have done several reports on this over the years. I think that in the estimate for the period that we last did, excuse me, if you want to ask me another questions, I'll find it. I do have that in my notes, is, I believe, $400 million.
Thank you. Mr. Bex, I wanted to ask you, because there was an insinuation earlier that if we had legislation that closed some of these loopholes, that would decrease production of oil and gas on public lands. Is that true in your findings?
Representative DeGette, I have never seen a substantial impact of tax rates or royalty rates adversely on production. As Director of Revenue in Montana, every time the Montana legislature came into session, we were asked as a department to analyze how our tax system compared on oil and gas with Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana. Were our rates too high, and was it discouraging production? We would look at these rates, and we would find that the highest rate of taxation would be in Wyoming, where the highest production exists. Then we would find that the next highest rate of production was in North Dakota. And guess what? They were nearly as high in taxation as Wyoming. They were getting higher over the periods I was looking at. Then we would look at Montana. Yes, our production is lower because, it was lower than in North Dakota and Wyoming, but our taxes were lower. And then we look at South Dakota, and there was no production and there was no tax. Okay. So the point is, where the rates are higher, there's more production, because geology and technology, not rates and regulation, determine oil and gas production.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Before we bring the hearing to a close, I'd like to ask each witness one last question. What was the one question you were not asked today that you wish you were asked, and what is the answer? And we will start with you, Mr. Rusco. Go right down.
Well, I'd like to have weighed in on the decrease in oil and gas development on federal lands compared to private and state lands. That's all to do with resources. It's all to do with where the resources are, and there are more shale resources on non-federal lands than anywhere else. If you look at any place where the resources are common between state and federal, you'll see development in both areas. People do not avoid federal lands. And if you have a longer historical view, there was long periods of time where federal lands were where everything was at with the same regulations. We shouldn't have the same regulations. We should update them for technology that has changed, costs have fallen, resource extraction has gotten better, and we're sitting with 100-year-old regulations and royalty collection.
Thank you so much. Mr. Putnam.
Thank you, Representative DeGette. I think the question I wasn't asked that would be helpful to think about is the role that natural gas has played in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and displacing coal power. And it is true that it has a role in that, along with the renewable resources. However, the benefit from that has been vastly eroded by the waste and leak of methane, which is why I think a number of the leading natural gas producers are pushing for tight methane regulations, because they realize that how long a bridge natural gas can be as a bridge fuel depends on how well these leaks are tightened. If we don't tighten it, it has to be an exceptionally short bridge.
Thank you. Ms. Gamma.
Thank you. I would like to continue on that line of thought, which is that the industry has, without federal, without state regulation, reduced greenhouse gas emissions and reduced methane emissions by 14%, and even as our production has increased over 50%. So we've reduced emissions per unit of production vastly, and we've done that absolutely. So it's not true that our leaks are eroding, because they're small in comparison to the tenfold decrease in the electricity sector that we deliver by fuel switching from coal to natural gas. So our leaks are in the order of around a percentage point. 1.4% is the EPA estimate, and that is right in the middle of about 8 different studies that show leakage rates. But we don't just rest on those laurels. We're constantly working to reduce our emissions because it's the product that we sell. So we have, on our own initiative, innovated to reduce those methane leaks, and we continue to do things like get rid of high bleed pneumatics, for example.
Thank
so
you
we're
so
doing
much.
all that.
Mr. Bucks.
Yes, Representative DeGette, I wish I were asked the question as to whether or not it's appropriate to offset regulatory costs against a royalty rate. And the answer is no, because The law requires a fair market return to the taxpayer on the mineral that is produced. There is no deduction for regulatory costs that are allowed in those contexts. Those costs, those regulatory costs, arise because the federal government has decided that they have a multiple use criteria to try to minimize the loss of alternative uses of the land and to protect the environment, to restore the land to its original condition is the goal in terms of, or so it's a usable condition afterwards, and to take care of other environmental and social circumstances. Those are legitimate objectives, and the federal government is not in competition with the states or the private sector. That's the wrong framework. You have laws that you've enacted, policies you've enacted, and the cost of pursuing those policies is not an allowable deduction from royalty rates. Royalty rates should be set at market value, period.
Thank you. Ms. Alexander.
I think I'd like to have been asked about the impact of the low rental and bid rates, in addition to the fact that we are losing money as taxpayers. As a result of this, there are many non-producing leases that are held because the rental rates are low, the bids are low, you can get them through non-competitive processing, and it encourages speculation. At the end of 2016, about half of the acres leased were not in production. In the state of Nevada, 97% of the leases in place are not in production, and that locks up that land from other uses. So I think that kind of looking at the overall incentive of how BLM is managing lands, having very low bid and rental rates is encouraging speculation and reducing the possibility of additional development. It could be other energy development other than oil and gas.
Thank you. I want to thank all the witnesses, and to let you know, the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.